And I'm Sandy Knapp, and I'm the current president of the Linnean Society of London. The Linnean Society is the oldest extant natural history society in the world. It was founded in 1788 by Sir James Edward Smith to look after the collections he had purchased from the great Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus. The Linnean Society is a place where people of anyone who's interested in natural history can come together and talk about some of the issues that there are in the world today, of which many of these pressing issues I'm sure Professor Boyd will talk to us about tonight. We're particularly happy to say that our fellows of the Linnean Society are not people from the ivory towers of academia. Fellows of the Society are people from all walks of life. Anyone who's interested in the science of natural history is welcome through the doors of the Society. And we hope that we're a place where people can talk about the really big issues which are confronting us today, both for biodiversity and for the wider environment, in a place where we can exchange ideas freely and talk between different sectors of society. So the Society is a place for meeting. And one of the great collaborations, as Padma said earlier, that we've had through the years is with the Systematics Association. And Padma mentioned that this policy lecture is one of those. The other one is a series of grants which we give, which are now titled Linne-Sys. And these are small grants to students, people in developing countries, to help them kickstart projects to study the biodiversity of the areas where they live or the things that they're particularly studying. And these grants, we give quite a few of these every year, and they're really nice for people to be able to, who need just a little bit of money to help with something. So I'd like now to pass over to Dr. David Williams, who's my colleague at the Natural History Museum, but is also the current president of the Systematics Association, to tell you a bit about the Systematics Association, but also to introduce our speaker. Dave, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Sandy. You probably covered most of the areas of our collaboration, so I'm just going to natter on for a very short while about what the Systematics Association does. For those who may not be aware of its existence, we are much younger than the Linnean Society, created around about the 1930s to investigate particular specific problems in systematics and taxonomy. A couple of things I need to say early on is that we've always worked really closely with, the associations always worked very closely with the Linnean Society, and we share an awful lot of common aims. It just so happens that at the moment, the Systematic Association is, I was thinking we're rewriting our constitution, which is not actually true. We're writing a constitution. So I can actually tell you what we've got there, so you get some idea of what we try and do, or what we are covering. We are going to, the principle of what we've written here is the principal objective of the association, the advancement of systematics and taxonomy as applied to all organisms. Its specific purposes are promote the study of the theory and practice of systematics and taxonomy, and to encourage, assist, and improve research and teaching in systematics and taxonomy. In plain English, what does that really mean? Basically, we promote all aspects of biodiversity as currently understood. Biodiversity in its broadest understanding. The association is made up of mostly professionals. There are some amateurs as well, but we maintain an active interest. As an organization, we maintain an active interest in how we can influence and also be influenced by major science policy decisions, hence the creation of this policy lecture with the Linnean Society. I've done a bit of quote mining, I'm afraid, just to dovetail in what our two organizations do with the presentation this afternoon. Right now, I guess most people involved in biodiversity issues are awaiting the outcome of the COP to COP26, which it says here, uniting the world to tackle climate change. There's another quotation which I thought was relevant. It says, again, I can't attribute them to anybody because they're kind of put on their pages without any attribution, but it says, we cannot afford to wait to act against the threat of climate change. We must work together to protect our planet and people and ensure a greener and more resilient future for us all. They're fine words, of course, but they do require from us humble scientists some understanding of the role of science in government. And that obviously leads me to my introduction of our speaker tonight, Professor Sir Ian Boyd. There are available some biographical details. I'm just going to give you a few of those because to give you some kind of context here. Ian, at the moment, is a professor at the University of St Andrews and chair of the UK Research Integrity Office. He was the chief scientific advisor to the UK government on food and environment, and significantly was involved, and I think I should put, I don't know how I should frame that word, but involved with SAGE. From my perspective, you'll forgive this, I hope, much more importantly, he's a really experienced marine and polar scientist, much more important, and once was a director, I think the first director of the Scottish Oceans Institute at St Andrews. I really need to say that he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society this year, so slightly belated congratulations. That's a great honour to do that. My last little bit of hunting around on the internet for useful information for this presentation was I came across a discussion concerning a group of experts who are going to advise Nicola Sturgeon on climate change. That will be headed up by Professor Boyd, headed up by Ian. In that article, Lang Banks, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, is the current director of the World Wildlife Fund, said, in most cases, this is really interesting, I think, in most cases, we already know what needs to be done to halt climate change and restore nature. We already know what needs to be done. So if we know, who gets it done and how? And my final little quotation before I pass this to Ian, I think it's probably his own words, is are governments using science as an integral part of government policy development? Ian, it's all yours.
Great. Let's see, am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah, all good, Ian.
Okay, thank you very much. David, thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction. There is one other thing that has happened recently, and that's I'm actually going on to the board of UKRI as well. So I'm being, having left government about 2.5 years ago, I'm being gradually, or just over 2 years ago, I'm being gradually hauled back into it to some extent. So, you know, what I want to do this evening is, well, first of all, say thank you very much for inviting me along to speak to you. It's always a bit daunting when you're speaking online to an audience when you can't see the whites of their eyes. And I'm sure there are some of you out there who know probably as much as I do about science and government and have had a lot of experience of it. So I, right from the start, I'll say this is a personal perspective. It's one built on quite a lot of experience, as David said. I was chief scientific advisor at DEFRA for 7 years, and then subsequently, quite a lot of work that I do currently, and actually my views of science and government have evolved quite significantly from when I first stepped into government, and they're even evolving now. And I'll try in my talk to take you through some of the reasons why that evolution has happened. What I'd like to do is I'll just move on to my first slide if I can. Yes, there we go. Okay, so what I'd like to do is really 3 things. First of all, I'd like to talk about how science functions in government, and I think that's something that a lot of people from outside government probably don't fully understand, and it is complicated. Science has all sorts of different ways of working alongside and inside government. And part of that is the second issue, which is about operational advice. and that's talking about what chief scientists do, and in particular about how we deal with emergencies and that sort of thing, which is very topical at the moment. And then I just want to give some examples of how science can help set strategy around key risks. And I'd like to speak a little bit about how SAGE works, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about that. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about future proofing and how science, can help to proof ourselves against future risks. So that basically is the structure that I like to go through. But in particular, what I'd like to point out initially is that there's a really clear difference between two sort of lines of argument here. One is science for policy, and the other one is policy for science. I think from a scientific community perspective, we often don't distinguish between these two, but when you're actually in government, the two are very different and quite distinct, although there is some overlap between them, as I'll say through the talk. But I will be talking about both of these to some extent, but mainly I think about science for policy, which is about the advisory process and about how science is integrated into the development of policy, rather than the policy for science, which is about kind of how much money do we spend on science and how do we spend it. But I will talk about that to some extent, because it tells us a little bit about attitudes in government towards science. So let's first of all dig down into how science functions in government. And this is quite a complex and busy diagram, but I asked the question, what does science do for government? Well, actually, I think it does four things, really. It's a generator of economic potential. In other words, it raises, it drives the economic machine, which creates revenues for government and creates taxes, because actually we grow the economy based on the back of the innovation and the technologies that we develop out of science. So that's an important first step. I also think it gives a lot of strategic policy guidance, and I'll expand slightly on what that really means in due course. But that's really about setting the agenda for the future. It's about what's called foresighting. It's about looking into the future and predicting what the future might look like in such a way that government can be much more prepared for the future than it would be otherwise. So it's really about prediction. And at the end of the day, science can be tested on whether it's any good at predicting the future or not, or predicting outcomes or not. And really, it's a reflection of the level of our knowledge of systems. The third area is in what I call tactical intervention, but essentially that's where policies are already created, they're running, and they need certain amounts of science to be done alongside them to make them work. One of the examples I use a lot is in fisheries management, where fundamentally the science is the policy, because the science is actually out there measuring the amount of fish there are in the sea, and it's setting the total allowable catch, which is essentially the policy for how much fish can be taken out of the sea. But that's rather simplistic. I mean, it's not simple to do, but it's a simple and straightforward example. But basically, tactical interventions in policy are by science are really, really important in a whole range of different areas. And my experience stretches all the way from neonicotinoid pesticides and the use of pesticides in agriculture through to many of you will remember the badger culling controversies, but that's really about management of bovine tuberculosis and the epidemiology of tuberculosis. So all that is really important to helping government deliver policies in one way or another. Whether you agree with them or not is another matter, but nevertheless, science is there to help support those functions. And then there's a fourth area, which is very sort of topical, which is around risk assessment and emergency response. And that's an area which has become very, obvious to the general public, and it's one that I'll come back to in due course. But if I can just sort of point to the diagram on the lower left-hand side here. I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but there's a diagram here which is my articulation of what science does within government. I've also said here it's important to distinguish between government and politics. I mean, government is really it's really a function to try to make the nation work. One way or another. Politics is overlaid on that to provide direction and leadership. But government is really an executive function to keep the nation going. And if you look at the diagram, I try to sort of envisage this in terms of Euclidean space, really, with different axes. There's an axis along the bottom there, which is kind of an ideological axis, and I've labeled it left and right. And of course, that could be the left of the political spectrum or the right of the political spectrum. But it's not just ideological, it's about subjective perspectives that people have on things. It's about politics, it's about aestheticism as well. And a lot of people spend a lot of their time, along that axis in one way or another. I think what science tries to do within that context is to draw a perpendicular axis to that, or an orthogonal axis to it, which is the axis of objectivity. And that's represented by the vertical line there, which is pointing toward realism. So it's trying to develop an objective argument within a sometimes highly charged, sort of politicized, highly subjective, ideological environment, and you only need to look at Parliament to see that in play. Science is there to try to provide objectivity within the context of it, and it doesn't really matter to certainly myself as a scientist where one sits along the horizontal axis there. The main thing is to try to push the vertical axis up as high as possible. Sometimes one doesn't get it all that high, but nevertheless, one has to try to be as objective as possible. So that's just one way that one might articulate it. I think the other thing to say before moving on from this slide is that when I look back to how science was used in government, let's say if you look at some of the histories that the books that Solly Zuckerman wrote about science and government in the 1960s, I mean, it is a much more mature process now than it was then. We really have moved on very significantly, and the importance of science in government is increasing, and it's increasing really in proportion to the importance of science in society, and government is a reflection in that sense of society overall. I think we still have some of the structures from the 1960s, and some of them are very functional. Some of them are much less functional, and maybe we need to think about how we move them on a bit. But nevertheless, I think that what we have, to some extent, is something like this, which is, you can ask the question, why should government be interested in science at all? Well, I mean, sometimes sometimes the answer to that sort of question is pretty obvious. But I think fundamentally there are two balancing processes here. One on the right, which is science is a solver of problems, and government has loads of problems, massive problems. and there's the other one on the left, which is it's a driver of economic growth and development. And if you like, the policy for science sits more on the left-hand side, the driver for economic growth and development, and the science for policy sits much more on the right-hand side, which is the solver of problems. And you know, one is a provider of essentially private good. It's about driving markets and competitiveness, and the other one is about generating public good, and it's about you know, improving collective governance. But I think the really interesting thing is when you overlay politics on the top of this. If you were to see this as you know, as two pans on a weighing scale, then the left-hand side would greatly outweigh the right-hand side in terms of political importance, and that creates a certain kind of problem, and it's a problem that really is generated by the fact that if we simply use science to drive economic growth and development, then actually it can create as many problems as it solves, and it can increase the problems on the right-hand side. So, and you know, we see that. I mean, climate change is a classic case of we've been really, really good at developing new systems for generating energy, and they've created a massive pollution problem for us, which has changed the atmosphere and is driving climate in a direction which is pretty negative for us. And we're trying to solve that problem, you know, post hoc. What we want to do is be ahead of those problems if we possibly can be. And I think that the politics tends to want to drive economic growth and development rather faster than we can necessarily solve some of the problems. And I think there's a big question about whether we are actually fast enough at solving the problems. And I think the climate change issue is one where is a good illustration of the fact that we probably aren't, and we're probably not as conscious of the need to balance off these two sides of this kind of this equation. But just to illustrate that a little bit, and how the priorities for science actually are delivered in government these days, what I've done is I've taken the delivery plan of UKRI, and I've just used this because I think it's just illustrative, and it's not in any way critical. It's simply an illustration of where priorities lie. And you've got different research councils here: AHRC, BBSRC, EPSRC, etc. And you can look at their functions. This is their strategic functions of the science that they deliver. And some of them sit much more on the problem solver side of things, and some of them sit much more on the economic development side of things. I mean, you see the amounts of money that are going into each side of those you know, that equation. The solver of problems, I mean, this is very rough, but it adds up to about 14% of the budget, whereas the economic growth and development adds up to about 63% of the budget. Now, I'm not saying that that's not the right balance to have, but I think there is a real question as to whether it is the right balance to have. And the problem that I see is that I don't think that we have an appropriately open debate about whether it's the right balance to have. And you know, I think that we need to have you know, a much richer discussion about whether using science to drive economic growth and development at that level is right, as opposed to using science to essentially support the health and welfare of people. And you know, that's a slightly controversial thing to say, but I don't think within government there is often sufficient debate about that, and certainly I think the public are not really very aware about how these things play out. And I think that drives political view of why science is funded, and science, I think, is fundamentally funded because most politicians support what I would call supply side innovation. There's a lot of political positivity about putting money into science, and there's an aspiration to try and get 22 billion per year spent on science. But that's fundamentally about driving the innovation machine. It's not necessarily about solving the problems that innovation machine actually creates. So most, I think, people and politicians in particular will support the supply side innovation side of things. Some support science as a bringer of good things. It's a sort of Kantian kind of ethic, where it's good to develop knowledge. There's some basic knowledge that we all would like to develop, even if it has no particular use. So there's some support for that, but there's probably least support for what one might call demand side intervention or demand side innovation, and that's where we need to drive behavioral change. We need to make significant adaptations to our lifestyles in order to cope with things like climate change, but quite a lot of other serious problems that we have. So the arguments about, the capacity to step back and see what we're doing is something that I think we, as chief scientific advisors in government are there to do. And our job is partly to point out some of these sorts of things. Whether people listen or not is another matter. But nevertheless, I think that if we keep on funding supply side innovation, which fundamentally is very politically attractive, because what it does is it builds widgets to make people happy. We create innovations to drive lots of lifestyle innovations, but also innovations to make ourselves more and more efficient, but also to consume more and more resources at the same time. Unless we actually balance that off with demand side innovations, we will just keep driving resource consumption up, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So I mentioned earlier on that science has a strategic role in trying to guide policy, and this is moving to a kind of science for policy discussion. And there are a number of points I would make under this. I think the first one is that government is hard work. I mean, when I moved into government from academia, I didn't think that I don't know what I expected to find, but I don't think I expected to find something that was quite as difficult as it is, and certainly was then, but certainly is now. Government deals with lots of really intractable problems, and one of the ways that I kind of like to express that is that I think in business we deal with problems where we know we can make money. If we're not going to be able to make money, then we drop it and go off and do something else. I think in academia we deal with problems that we think we can make progress with, and if we can't make progress with them, we drop them and we go off and do something else. In government, the problems you have in front of you, you cannot just drop and go off and do something else. I mean, some politicians may well do that, but actually it'll come back and bite them at the end of the day. So you are left holding the baby, as it were, in terms of the level of problems that you have to solve. Many of them are what you call intractable or wicked, messy problems. They're often very socially modulated types of problems, but science can help by articulating what the problem solving pathway might be. And I've put that at the bottom of this slide in terms of problem classification. So, we go from wicked problems potentially to complex problems, potentially to tame problems. Actually, in science, we mainly deal with what I would call tame problems. These are problems with tractable solutions. We often deal with complex problems. I think the structure and function of large-scale ecosystems, which is something that I spent a lot of my career working on, is a complex problem. But complex problems are still containable. They're maybe not solvable in a classical sense, but they're still containable. Wicked problems are really not containable. They're wicked because when you find a solution, or you think you find a solution, actually the problem changes. And that's very typical of socially modulated or politically modulated problems. I think in science, what we can do within government is point out when we are in a wicked problem state, and potentially the tracks towards taming a wicked problem, moving a wicked problem away from wickedness and into either complexity or taming, certainly along that track. And I felt that was a really important role that I had as a chief scientific advisor, was being able to stand back from the kind of problems and look at them in the round to help people who are buried in them. Their heads are down in the weeds, trying to solve these sorts of things, to see these problems actually in the round, and that may well help to provide solutions. It's quite difficult to provide specific examples, but I think for waste and resources was one area where I was able to do that. I won't go into the details of how that happened. And also, I think on the whole controversy about managing the bovine tuberculosis in the English countryside, which involved padger culling, where I think that we managed to move towards a strategy that was much more rounded and understood the wicked to tame progression much better than certainly when I came in, where it sounded like the department was simply using badger culling as a way of trying to solve a very, very big, complex and wicked problem. And fortunately, we moved on from that. So that's just an articulation of the kind of hard work that government is. The other thing is that science often can't help. And I think we have to be clear about this. There are sometimes things where science is not really able to make much progress. And one area that I had to deal with was the ethics of culling animals. How you slaughter animals. That actually is a values-based process. Okay, science can actually provide information about how long an animal takes to die and those sorts of things, but the reality is that that's a values process, and there's quite a lot of those sorts of things in government, and really it's just up to politicians to take a view on some of these sorts of things. There's also areas where there can be very high uncertainty, and in science we need to be completely honest about our uncertainty. If you're not honest about uncertainty, then you get rumbled. And sometimes we know so little about a subject, you just have to say, sorry, we can't help. There just isn't really enough information to be able to help here. That doesn't often happen, but I think sometimes we aren't as clear about our uncertainties as we should be. And I've put a little diagram on the right here, which needs a little bit of explanation. I concocted this because actually I got very worried that sometimes the scientific community was saying to government, well, we just need to do more research. And actually, in some areas, more research actually doesn't result in more knowledge, especially areas where there is high uncertainty and where some of the research is maybe not as good as it could be. Now, that's not necessarily criticism of the researchers who do it, but some of the research, it just is very, very difficult to do because we can't get the sample sizes or whatever it might be. And what that research does by just generating more uncertain information is just add more uncertainty to the problem rather than actually resolving the problem. And what you can get is from early research, and what this curve is there to represent. From early research, you can actually get you can increase knowledge, but actually after a while you get to an asymptote where unless you have a revolution in the design of the experiments or some sort of technological change that makes you able to gather information much more precisely, more research actually creates more obfuscation around the problem. And there were whole areas of science where I just felt that so much low quality research had been done that it was really quite hard to understand where the gems sat and what it was really saying. Now, that's quite a controversial thing to say, but nevertheless, it's something that I think the scientific community needs to really, really look at and be very careful about. And also in research, sometimes it just is enormously expensive to get a result. So sometimes the costs don't, or the benefits don't justify the cost. And then just finally here, as I've said, science can help to define the problem, and I've already gone through from the wicked to the tame sequence. But almost all issues that government has to deal with have strong sociological components. So they tend to sit at the wicked end of the spectrum. The way that one tries to move through this sequence from wicked to tame is through adaptive management of processes. It's about setting up an idea about how this might be managed, or how a problem might be managed, setting up policy, putting it in place, seeing if it works, and if it doesn't work, modify it and move on. And that brings me to the next slide, which is actually something I learned while in government, which is that actually government is not that different to science. In fact, I think policy is just science in practice. It's a very applied science. And what I've put here is on the left-hand side, I've put the classical policy cycle from problem definition to policy formulation, to policy design, to policy implementation, evaluation, and then back to definition. So, that's the way that policy is supposed to be implemented. In reality, it's not really, it's much more linear than that, but that's the way it should happen. And then on the right-hand side, there's a science cycle, which is problem definition, hypothesis formulation, experimental design, experimental implementation, observation, and then evaluation of whether your experiments worked or not. And the two are exactly the same, really. It's just that one happens at sort of large scales in large sort of politicized social environments. And the other one is a much more controlled, disciplined process. But I think that the policy cycle can learn a lot from the science cycle, and the two actually, and vice versa, actually. And what I felt I was doing as a chief scientific advisor was I was actually practicing science in the form of policy. So the clean air zones we have in cities now were really set up based on the advice that I gave around how many you needed in order to have a sample size, how long they needed to run for in order to be able to get clear results out, and a process by which you evaluate the results. And then once you've evaluated them, you need to have a review period. You need to set up the hypothesis again and possibly modify the clean air zones and move on. So that's just a large scale, multi-decadal experiment that we're doing in the context of policy. So when people think of policy and they think of science, they think of something, I think that most of the time they think of something that's quite different from each other, but actually I don't think they are so different. So if I just move on, let's move to operational advice and chief scientists, etc. Well, you know, I was a chief scientist, and there's quite a lot of chief scientists around in departments and you know, representing governments, and I've got you know, a range of them here, some current, some past. I think the attributes of chief scientists are that you need to be pragmatic. You know, sometimes things just aren't really possible, and you just got to be able to move on from them. You need to be a realistic and a realist, you know, and it goes back to my diagram earlier on about trying to drive for realism, objectivity, and you need to be as impartial as possible. In other words, you know, again, the diagram with the two axes, you can work anywhere on that axis, on the horizontal axis, the ideological axis. And be impartial, you know, relative to where people's ideologies sit. That can be a tough thing for some people, but you know, I think if it's tough for you, you're probably not cut out to be a chief scientific advisor. And then there's a sort of skill set for people, and I've given this as a skill set for chief scientific advisors, but actually this is a skill set that any scientist who's working with people in government probably needs to have. And you need to have a certain sense of independence. In other words, you need to be able to feel as if, at least everybody has interests, but you need to feel as if you have independence of action. Nobody is ever independent, but you know, you need to feel that. You need to have integrity, honesty, objectivity, and partiality. There's an authoritativeness that needs to come from chief scientific advisor, and that comes from your experience as a scientist, and you know, probably several decades of experience. Respected and wise, and you know, it's quite interesting working with ministers. You know, many of them are highly intelligent people, but actually, you know, they're quite ordinary people, and when you're working with them at an individual level, they often defer to you because you actually, they see you as a wise person, and you've got to kind of play that part to some extent with them, because that actually builds trust. You have to have a breadth of interests. You know, you know, I'm a sort of classically trained zoologist who moved into you know, systems science, essentially. I had to deal with everything from the chemistry of plastic bags to the epidemiology of animal disease, and you know, the structure and function of the farming system and food flows and all that sort of stuff. So that, you know, that you need to be able to embrace breadth, and not all scientists are comfortable doing that. Political intelligence you need to have. I've talked a bit about that. Thick skin, tough-minded. Able to listen. You know, some people might criticize me for not being good enough at listening, but organizational intelligence is really important. You're sitting in the middle of a massive bureaucratic machine, so you need to understand where you sit in that, what the different nuances are in how people work and function. You need to be an opportunist, because the way that politics works is that sometimes there are issues which just, you know, you can start up on issues, but you will make no progress unless the politics are aligned, and you need to understand how the politics are aligning in order to be able to make progress. And when they do align, it's like the stars in the sky aligning. You've got to be in there and make it work, because it won't align for very long. And that needs patience as well. And I felt I had 4 functions as a chief scientific advisor. I had an inward-facing function, organizing the department, an outward-facing function, which was representing the scientific views of the department, the world, an advisory function, which was kind of the one-to-one advice with senior officials and ministers, and then an emergency response function, which I'll come back to in a minute. There's also, sitting alongside that, there's a big apparatus of scientific process sitting within government, and so a lot of that is in the form of scientific advisory committees of various sorts. And I had a science advisory council. Charles Godfrey was my was the chair of that science advisory council. And then underneath that, or with that, there's various statutory committees which are usually populated by scientists. And then so there's some ad hoc advisory committees. And you know, in DEFRA alone, we perhaps at any one time had been between 200 and 300 scientists who were all manning these committees that were helping the policies function. So they were feeding in to the policy directorates. And the policy directorates also get support from public sector research establishments, and you know, things like the Animal Plant Health Agency that does all the surveillance for animal disease, and Public Health England is another example of a public sector establishment of that type. National Physical Laboratory, there's quite a number of them, and they feed in. There is a big question, and I don't have time to go through it now, whether we have sufficient public sector research establishments and whether they are of sufficient quality and are looked after by government. But that's something I can, you know, I can come back to at another point. But we need science to be independent of policy. We need to draw on the best expertise, and we integrate policy with the delivery structures, and that's what this tries to do. However, does it work? Well, not really. You know, I think it's pretty clunky, is the way I would put it, and it doesn't have the same traction as having somebody like a chief scientific advisor sitting inside government, building the personal relationships with the people who are actually making the decisions. It works to some extent. I talked about fisheries. It works in that sense, in that we've got a public sector research establishment, does the research on fisheries, it produces the data, and that creates the policy. It's a very, what I would call a continental style of scientific advice. This is the way the our European neighbours tend to do it. It's the way the European Commission tends to do it, through these committee structures. It keeps science separate from policy. I'm very much an advocate of integrating science with policy, if one possibly can, and making them actually one and the same thing. And I think they'll function much, much better in that mode. So just moving on to some examples, and we're coming towards the end of this now. What impact can scientists really have? Well, one of them that I felt I had, at least, was to be able to articulate what I call chronic emergencies and strategic challenges. And there is no doubt that we have some absolute, as a country, as the human race, we have some massive strategic challenges, and these are what I would call slow-moving emergencies. There are things like non-communicable disease, particularly in the wealthy nations of the world, but the UK has that in spades. We've got emerging and exotic diseases. We've just had COVID-19 as a good example of that. The quality of food and water and air in future, I mean, these are the fundamentals of life, is very much in question, and you know, whether we can sustain the quality is a really big question. We've got the massive problem of resource depletion. The diagram on the left is the domestic resource extraction globally, and it just keeps going up and up and up. I mentioned this earlier on. We just keep multiplying our resource needs in a almost exponential fashion. And then the opposite of resource consumption is resource depletion, is waste. Is the production of waste. For every item of resource we consume, then it exits the economy as waste. So the only way we're going to be able to control waste is if we control consumption fundamentally. And then finally, there's climate change. And of course, I don't see climate change as anything bigger than all the other ones. So we've got COP26 coming up, and COP26 is taking all our attention. But actually, there's half a dozen other things sitting there which are just as big and need just as much attention. And I'll draw your attention to the diagram on the bottom right, which is actually the resource use by different sectors of the economy. Sorry, it's a bit small here, but we've got agriculture, forestry, and fishing here at the top, manufacturing, energy and water, construction, transport and communications, other services, etc. And right at the bottom here, we've got financial and business services. But the point is here that agriculture, forestry and fishing, and it's mostly agriculture, uses vast amounts of resources and is very, very inefficient. And of course, agriculture produces our food. And our food is produced unbelievably inefficiently. It's about 4 times less efficient than the next least efficient sector of the economy. And actually, I think most people are just either immune to that or unaware of that. And so, if we want to get to net zero by 2050, we fundamentally have to transform our food system. And we are a long, long, long way from doing that. So that's the kind of message that that chief scientific advisors are able to give. And actually, in those terms, I gave that message within DEFRA, that message on food within DEFRA. And what does this emerge? Again, I think what science can do is step back from this slightly and try to help people to understand what's going on here. And again, this is my take on it, is that, I think that in society we have, I think, 3 competitive discourses going on. One is a discourse on sustainability that I think that we're all aware of, and that is probably COP26 is all part of that. There's another discourse on tragedy, which is about the tragedy of the commons, and it's all going wrong, etc. And we're all doomed. And there's another discourse on adaptation, which is one which is driven very much by economics, which is that, if we invest in innovation, we can innovate our way out of the problems that we have. And of course, that's why we're spending so much money on science to drive economic growth. It's why that balance that I talked about earlier on is weighed towards the investments in science and innovation. But the question is whether any of these make sense at all. I think they all make sense to some extent, and different people will adhere to them to different extents. But all of them have weaknesses. The adaptation one, which is about we'll innovate our way out of the problem, really relies on the fact that we're able to do that, that we will keep ahead of the problems that we create as a result of our existence. And there's no guarantee that that's the case. And in fact, the rates of innovation per unit of expenditure that we're able to develop now are much less than they were towards the end of last century. So our rate of innovation is actually declining. So that's a big problem. But I won't go into that in any more detail. It's really just an illustration of the kind of sort of big scale messages that we need to give. I'm going to turn now to not just from chronic emergencies to acute emergencies. And I had, while I was Chief Scientific Advisor, was involved in a number of emergencies, one of which was the Salisbury emergency where SAGE ran, and then I ran a sort of chronic SAGE for quite a long period of time and chaired it while we were cleaning up Salisbury. That was kind of one of my responsibilities. And this just provides the structure here of how emergencies are dealt with. You've got COBRA at the top, the Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms, that's what it stands for. And on the left-hand side, there's the sort of the response structure, which is a command structure, which the police and potentially the military, but some of the civilian services around nuclear, etc., would be involved in. And then on the right-hand side here, we have SAGE with inputs to COBRA. We also have something called the National Risk Assessment, which covers all the major risks we think could happen very broadly, and these are played out. These are practiced in the context of this kind of structure that we see here. Obviously, this is very relevant to the current situation, but the SAGE that we have at the moment that deals with COVID-19 has evolved to some extent from this, in that it doesn't just input COBRA, it inputs to various other parts of the Cabinet Office and other parts of government, including Department of Health and Social Care. So what does SAGE do, and what does it not do? And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this. Well, SAGE does have an existence designed around each emergency. So, and the opposite of that is that when there isn't an emergency, there isn't a SAGE. So SAGE is not a standing committee, essentially. It reports to COBRA. It doesn't report to anybody else. It's just COBRA. It doesn't report to the nation or anything like that. It's just COBRA. It convenes national and international expertise of relevance to the particular emergency. It collates and summarizes evidence. It responds to questions from policy teams and government, but mainly from COBRA. It provides succinct advice based on a consensus process. It works as much as possible in private. Now, that's controversial, but actually there are lots and lots of good reasons why it works in private, and I can go into those later on if necessary. It publishes its advice in a timely way. Now, in a timely way depends on the circumstances, but it doesn't sort of walk out of a SAGE meeting with a press release and give it out, because actually it's reporting to COBRA. What it doesn't do is it doesn't have a duty to be public facing. Many people would have wanted it to have, but it doesn't have that duty at the moment, and it may be that it needs to have something like that in the future, but that's a debatable point. It doesn't think up policy or operational options. It simply looks at the evidence based on the sort of questions and the problems that exist. And I think that's something that the press found it particularly difficult, that you could get a bunch of intelligent people around the table during an emergency like the COVID-19 emergency, and we weren't kind of brainstorming policy options. No, we're not doing that. We're simply looking at the scientific evidence. It doesn't commission research. It doesn't discuss politics or policy. It does not take an ideological position on things. It does not take account of all scientific perspectives, because it just would be impossible in the timescales that are in play. And those involved don't get emotionally involved in the subject. Now, that's a difficult thing to do, and some people perhaps do on occasions, but actually around the SAGE table, there is no emotion. It is purely looking at the scientific advice. So that's how SAGE works and doesn't work. And I hope it's helpful. Just to finish off, I think that science advice and government, just in terms of setting the future tone, can, especially having gone through the COVID-19 experience, can try to articulate a bit more about what it's like to be a resilient nation, And you know, if I was in government now, I would be saying this, and in fact, I am saying this to government. So, what are the qualities of a resilient nation? Well, they're listed here. This is some work I've done with some colleagues through the Royal Society of Edinburgh. We have, you know, high diversity, so that's diversity of supply as well as diversity of opinion and those sorts of things. We have redundancy within the system. Actually, that redundancy is probably not a great term. We have spare capacity within the system. We have connectivity, and that's connectivity, everything from you know, electrical grids all the way through to food supply chains, but also social connectivity as well. Inclusiveness, equity, and fairness. In other words, we need to make sure that people are involved so that they know what is going on, but importantly, they know what, you know, how to benefit, but also they know that they have a cost to bear as well. We need to be able to adapt. So this is about adaptive management. You know, we need to learn from our experiences and have an adaptive process. And we need a culture of preparedness, which I think that we failed on. And you know, if you actually look at a whole load of at this sort of list and try to tick off where the UK was prior to the COVID-19 emergency, actually we weren't very good on most of these, and we probably still are not very good on them. And then I suppose just finally, you know, what are the actions that I would suggest as a resilient we need as a resilient nation? Well, we need risk registers and assessments. Well, we've got them, but actually we don't tell anybody about them. How can people be resilient to risks if we don't tell them what the risks are? The National Risk Assessment is a secret document. There are some things in it that probably should be secret, but actually most of it doesn't need to be secret. People need to know about what the risks are. So we need open and honest communication with people about what the risks are. We need to be explicit about allocating responsibility for risk management to businesses, to institutions. Government cannot carry all these risks itself. It cannot be the insurer against all the things that go on. We need to insure ourselves as a system and as a nation, and that's about allocating responsibility. We need to be able to measure progress and assess progress. We need a rapid uptake of technology. I think we had that during COVID-19, but we need to be really much better at it into the future. And you know, we need to mainstream all of this right across all sectors of government. And this is where I think government really sometimes fails, and where science can make a difference. And certainly as chief scientific advisors, sometimes I've felt that chief scientific advisors were the only people from the different silos of government who are actually talking to each other a lot of the time. So science can actually act as a glue that can actually try to break down some of the silos and make government work in a more wholesome way. And then finally, just some conclusions here. I think that integration of science within government is essential. I've said that already. And I think science is increasing in importance in government. I mean, I think it's increasing in society, so therefore in government it is almost certainly increasing. Whether it's recognized by everybody as increasing in its importance is another matter. I think we could have much greater explicit involvement of science, and that brings certain advantages, many of which I've described. But there does need to be a greater understanding of the role of science across government. And that's not just within government itself, that is within the science community. For a very long time, I think we've had the CP Snow two cultures sort of on our backs, where you've got one culture of the classically trained civil servant, and another culture of the kind of slightly brash scientist who calls a spade, and the two don't meet. There's a fence between, or a wall between, or partition between them, and they speak to each other across a partition. You know, the scientists throwing some evidence across the wall and saying, well, there you are, have it, you know, it's up to you to do what you want with it. We can't go on doing government like that. It just doesn't work. And I think we've been doing that for a very, very long time, and we've got to stop. And that's what I mean by integration. This will lead to better problem definition and better methodology for solving the problems. And what I talked about in terms of resilience is an example of how that might work. And at the end of the day, I think it will lead to better preparedness and resilience to some of the risks, and those risks are very substantial. And with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention. I think I've gone on a little bit longer than I should have, but thank you very much indeed. Sandy.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating, and it's very interesting to hear all of those different things from the position of someone who's actually been on the inside. We're getting questions, a lot of questions quite quickly now. First one is a bit complicated. Is this week, many of the UK's leading science and technology bodies wrote to the Chancellor laying out the rationale for increasing investment by focusing on things like fueling economic growth or boosting productivity rather than on sustainability and biodiversity. So do you think, given that, do you think the science and innovation sector is taking enough notice of the recommendations of the government-sponsored Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, understanding that our economies are embedded within nature and not external to it? So I guess that's a question about the Dasgupta review.
Yeah,
how seriously it's being taken.
Yeah, really good and interesting question. I think that the scientific community is as divided on these sorts of things as the politicians are. You know, there are parts of the scientific community that are there to drive the economic machine. You know, they're there to take the innovation money and to translate that into great inventions and things like that, and that's wonderful. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. But you know, I think that it's the size it is, and we have the number of scientists there that we have because societally we've made almost subliminal choices about what's most important. And we make those choices based on the fact that we want more stuff, basically. We want better lives, you know, all those sorts of things. But we, and I say that's the big we, it's the science community as well, or big parts of the science community as well as the policy community tend to bury the what I call the demand side problems, which is what the Dasgupta review really cover. It's about where the limits lie to exploitation and where the limits lie to you know, in terms of technology. And you know, I think the scientific community is as divided on this as society is. There are scientists who pay a lot of attention to things like what Partha Dasgupta was saying, and there are a lot who benefit from the large expenditure that government makes in innovation and technology development, and they will follow their interests. You know, I think is the way I would put it. But I think we do need to be very clear in our debating about this, that the scientific community is not as one on it, and that there are different points of view. And I think that we don't bring that to the surface enough. And what I've tried to do this evening is explain how we might bring it to the surface a bit better than we have in the past. Great,
thank you. I think that's a really important point about the fact that, you know, so this is signed by lots and lots of people. And so it sounds like it's the unified scientific community, whereas in fact, possibly it's not. There's another question about SAGE itself. And Roger Butlin has asked, he says, I'm quite surprised that SAGE does not commission research itself. It's surely well placed to see important gaps in knowledge. Is there a different route for filling these gaps?
Yeah, I mean, SAGE doesn't have budgets. It's a bunch of scientists who've got together to try and, you know, advise about a problem. it sometimes commissions reviews, you know, because we need to collate the information and the data and that sort of thing, but it doesn't commission specific research. That's for the UKRI and Wellcome and other organizations to do. In the context of most emergencies, many of which, you know, SAGE might sit 3, 4, 5 times over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. It's just irrelevant. You know, the situation we've experienced in COVID-19 in terms of how SAGE has operated has been unprecedented. It's just a very different kind of feel, because SAGE has met for well over 100 times over, you know, an 18-month, almost 2-year period, you know, under those circumstances, you could have got into commissioning research, but actually the best thing to do is to really have people from the funding organizations observing and allowing them to pick up the messages about where the gaps might sit, so that they can, you know, potentially fund that. And that's what happened, actually. You know, UKRI has funded quite a lot of the gaps in the COVID-19, as Wellcome has as well. So, you know, SAGE doesn't do the commissioning, but it does point out where the gaps might be.
Okay, so that's great. So another question is about the role of public sector research establishments, and they've been reduced over many decades. Should they be reinvigorated? And if so, how can they be rebuilt in such a way that their activities and skills are relevant to the future and emerging challenges? I'm really interested in this.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, of course. You know, and I have a kind of narrative that says that, you know, following the experience of the Second World War, the UK, you know, built up a public sector research capability, a very significant one across science and technology, and also in agriculture. You know, there was a lot of activity there because of the need to you know, feed the nation, basically, and that sort of grew through the 1950s and 1960s, and sort of into the 1970s it kind of leveled off, and then we got to the Rothschild Review of 1971, which fundamentally put it into a large decline, because what Rothschild recommended was essentially to marketize the science delivery to government. In other words, to use the marketplace for government to go to get its science. Now, essentially, that's what has driven the funding model that has created the universities. And we've got a fantastic university system. You know, it's enormous, but it's actually been at the cost of the funding for PSREs, public sector research establishments. And if you look at some of, you know, our equivalent, France and Germany are very different in that respect. They did not make that shift in the 1980s. And the result is that ever since then, we've been disinvesting in our public sector research establishments, and many of them have just disappeared completely. I have been banging on about this for a very long time. Whether I've had any effect or not is another matter, but I think that we're turning a corner on that. I think COVID-19 has illustrated just how important the kind of standing army of if you like, of scientists in the public sector is just how important that is. The question is, what should it look like in future? And I know that Paul Nurse is doing a review of this now for the Secretary of State, and it'll be interesting to see what Paul comes up with. I mean, I think he did a really good job in terms of his previous review, which resulted in the creation of UKRI. I think this is a logical next step. But you know, is it going to be just maintaining what we've got, or is it going to be creating new institutions? And we have lots and lots of different flavors of public sector research establishments now as well. There are some that are, they're not called PSRAs, but there are some that are essentially charities. There are some that are, part-owned joint ventures with private sector, and there are some that are just not say just, but are classical government-owned institutions. So, and all of them actually have been designed in that way because they fit their own purpose. And I think we do need to be able to step back from that and say, is this do we have the right mix here, and are we funding it to the right sort of levels? And I think the answer to both of those questions, in my view, is no, we don't have the right mix, and no, we're not funding them to the right levels. But that's just my personal view.
Well, that's nice to hear. So another question is about engineering and the role of engineering in all of this. Is where does engineering fit into these kind of structures and into the future? Because it's engineering that usually ends up implementing the innovation that does come from science.
Yeah. So when I talk about science, I really kind of put a very large set of arms around a very large kind of body of people, and it's everything from social science through natural science, I think, to engineering, and of course, there's a spectrum there, and each blends into the other. So I would certainly count engineering in with pretty much everything I've said. And certainly when I was at DEFRA, I was the head of profession for science and engineering, and actually there were a lot of engineers in DEFRA, or at least in the Environment Agency. They were mainly water engineers and that sort of thing. So yeah, absolutely. And I'm a trustee of the National Oceanography Centre, and it has lots and lots of very good scientists, but also has a lot of engineers who build some fantastic robotic kit that glides around the ocean and stuff like that. So all that is part of the same narrative as far as I'm concerned.
So it's whether you use the word science or whether you say STEM.
Yes, yeah, I mean, absolutely, I could say STEM, but actually, and I should have probably qualified my terminology at the beginning. So I apologize for not doing that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, but it's an important thing because I think we do think about things in silos sometimes. And as you pointed out, really, really very eloquently in your talk, thinking about things in silos is sometimes not very, very useful. There's another question about the lack of diversity. And to what extent is the lack of diversity in the scientific workplace a problem when thinking about scientific advice into government?
Oh, I think it's huge. It's a huge problem. I mean, it's a problem across society, but science is particularly prone to lack of diversity. I mean, it was interesting. I was at the other end of a lecture last night where somebody from the floor asked, the panel if they could think of, an eminent Black scientist, to the credit, one of the people in the panel came up with some names, but actually there are so few. It's really ridiculous, actually, there's you can hear I'm really struggling for words here, but we talk about these sorts of things, but we don't do enough about sorting this, and we really do need to do things to sort it. And I would hope, if I have any influence at all, I will try to shift things as much as I possibly can do, because it is very deep-seated. I think that the suggestions from there's quite a lot of recent suggestions that science is a deeply kind of flawed, works with a deeply flawed model that benefits certain groups, is absolutely correct. And I have to sit here and say, well, I'm one of them. But at a personal level, I'd really love to do something about that. And we've got to stop talking about it and actually get on and do something about it.
I couldn't agree more. And that kind of leads into the next question, which is something that actually we've been thinking about at the Linnean Society. We've been thinking about these issues about what can we as a learned society do to help shift this curve of diversity. But Gail's asked the question, is the UK has a rich variety of scientific societies, and what's the ideal role they should play in this science policy landscape?
Well, I think the learned societies, I'll call them that, the kind of the broad brush learned societies. I mean, I think there's a lot of specialist societies, and I think they have a role in terms of, developing their subject area and developing excellence in the subject area. But if your question's around diversity, I think this is for absolutely everybody to deal with. But I think that some of the learned societies could be much more directed in how they develop people from based on gender and ethnicity, but also all sorts of other minority groups, how they develop them into important leadership roles, and they're the sort of bread and butter of how the science community really works. And I'm sure that all of them have this on their agendas. The question is just whether we really are being serious enough about it and really getting on with it. I'm president-elect of the Royal Society of Biology, and it's one of the things I will be trying to major on there. Whether I will be able to do much about it or not is another matter. But the reality is we've got to be much more proactive about it than we have been in the past.
Well, yeah, and then the other half of that question is about how should these, so learned societies, as you say, and are looking at lots and lots of different things, but how do you think learned societies or sort of these scientific societies, not just the learned societies, but how should they interact with the kind of policy landscape? How should that?
Well, okay, so maybe I misinterpreted your question. It's about the policy landscape.
Kind of both, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So the policy landscape, that's a difficult question to answer. Well, it is a difficult question to answer, because one of the problems with the policy landscape, as we call it, is that even though government is big and bureaucratic and everything else, and there's lots of people in it, when you actually drill it down to an issue, there's probably only one or two people who are responsible for that issue. And I used to say to university colleagues who I would meet on occasions, who for very good reasons, wanted to engage. I said, well, there's over 120 universities in the UK. If every single one of them individually wants to engage, we'll just get completely swamped. In government, everybody's running around trying to do things all the time. They don't have any spare time at all. They'd love to engage, absolutely. They're really desperate for that engagement process, but they simply don't have the time, and there aren't enough of them. So I think it behoves on the societies and the institutions as well to work together to actually really boil down what they want to say to the policy community, and do that in the most efficient way possible, time efficient way possible. If everybody from every scientific society wanted to have a half-hour meeting with somebody in government policy, in the relevant government policy, then the people in government would do nothing else. It would be enormously difficult for them to get on with any other things, and that's just not possible. So we need to think about ways of delivering that information that they need and creating the dialogue that can go on, or that could go on. We need to do that as constructively as possible and imaginatively as possible. It's difficult. There are some things will work better than others, but it was partly my job as a chief scientific advisor to try to activate those relationships if I possibly could. Mm-hmm. Some worked, the majority probably didn't, to be quite frank.
So collaboration is key, and that's true across science as well. It's becoming much more collaborative. It is collaboration, but the thing is that we need what I call a porous boundary between science and policy, and it's about this integration. You know, to some extent, if you're a scientist and you go and spend 3 or 5 years working in policy, getting back into science is really hard. It shouldn't be, and this comes back to the diversity issue again. It should not be. That should be seen by the scientific community as really positive. And similarly, for somebody who's developed their career within policy, they may have a scientific training, who wants to spend time in science. It's really, really difficult for them to do that. We have barriers, huge barriers sitting there to this movement of people across those apparent divides, and we've got to get rid of those divides. I did my best to try and do that while I was in government, but it's actually really hard because they are culturally deeply embedded. Mm-hmm. I think that's a call to arms. There's one last question, which is an interesting one, is why is it that the UK, or there's another one has just come, people always think of questions at the last minute. Why is it that the UK is so good at scientific innovation, but bad at putting it into practical use? Should government play a greater role to correct this?
Well, government wants to play a greater role, and I think that if we get 22 billion spent on science and innovation, a lot of the extra money will go into moving the process of invention and innovation along that innovation trackway. I think some of it will go into basic research, but actually I think an awful lot of it will be about trying to move it on. But I think we need to be careful. Actually, I think we scold ourselves an awful lot for how bad we are at this. Actually, we're not that bad. We're actually, relative to many of our competitors, we're actually quite good at it. It's just that we're not as good as we know we could be at it. And one of the reasons for it is not about dealing with the valley of death kind of problem of innovation. It's really about how capital investment works, and the fact that the UK is really quite a small part of the total global innovation system. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the capital isn't there, but sometimes when the capital is there, it's actually overseas capital. And what it does is it buys up the inventions and takes them elsewhere. So we need a system that captures our own inventions and keeps them here if we can do. And I know that the government is working on that actually at the moment, and it's a recognised problem. But I think we need to congratulate ourselves a bit, because actually we're pretty good at it.
Well, you always hear about the bad cases, don't you?
Yeah.
Someone has said, it's just mentioned that there are many scientists and people interested in science, that there are so many scientists and people interested in science that they couldn't all interact with government. So perhaps there are, in the professional sense, too many scientists and more practical people involved, though nothing wrong with being interested in science. So are there too many of us, Ian? Too many of you and me?
No, I couldn't agree. I do not agree with that. I think there are probably too many of us who respect the silo that we're in, and it's understandable. We like to think of ourselves as scientists, so therefore we brand ourselves as scientists. We develop ourselves culturally as scientists, but we do need to have the breadth of mind to be able to step in to other circumstances, to have the I suppose it's the wish and to want to go and do something slightly different, and there's risks associated with that. But I think that the profession should de-risk that to a very great extent. One of the things that I keep saying is that actually government deals with some of the most difficult and interesting problems for science. It's like science doesn't want to deal with government, but it's actually by not dealing with government a lot of the time, it's missing out on this incredibly rich set of problems that exist. And I think we do need to engage with that. We like to sit in our own bubble. We like to do our own stuff, and that's good. But actually, I think that we do need to look into somebody else's bubble for a while and think, actually, that's a really interesting problem. And how do we operationalize the measurement of biodiversity, for example, in such a way that you can make sure that if an individual farmer increases the biodiversity on his or her land, they can get compensated for it, and it can be legally implemented. That's an interesting problem. It really is. Yeah. And fundamentally, we can't do it at the moment, or it's really hard.
It's difficult. And I think there's also that thing of being able to kind of step outside your own self and try to see the world through someone else's eyes.
Yeah.
Because we look at things in the same way. Oh, well, thank you so much, Ian, for a really interesting talk and a whole set of, fantastic answers to some really quite probing and difficult questions, and some things that have really given us all a lot to think about. And have a lovely time as president of the Royal Society of Biology and on the UKRI board and all those other things. And I'm sure that your influence will be felt, and we look forward to seeing that in the next few years. So thank you so much for coming along, and thanks for a fantastic talk. There are people saying thank you in the chat. So thanks ever so much. And I thank you from both the Linnean Society's perspective and also from that of the Systematics Association. It's a great collaboration, and it's really important for us to, hear some of the things about how the government works and how policy works, because sometimes it also feels like a closed box. So it's fantastic. Yep. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
And it's a pleasure, and thank you for listening.